Okay, so let me say good morning again and welcome everyone. It's good to see you. If you are relatively new to Westside Services, I'm happy to have you here. I'm Reverend Carol Bedeau. I am privileged to serve Westside as minister, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. So today's topic is a little bit of a heavy one. Last week we were talking about freedom and the open road and our ability to travel and go have adventures and how much of part of the American ethos it is. And I made a comment that is really built on a foundation of some not so great stuff. Slavery, enslavement of Africans and African Americans, the stealing of native lands, forced labor in our own history in this country, of child labor in the Industrial Revolution, you know, and forced labor of lots of people building railroads, Chinese people building railroads, all kinds of stuff, right? But I said that's a whole nother sermon. And what I've discovered in the last week is that it's a whole lot more sermons. So we're gonna just scratch the surface today. And what I want to invite us to do is, as I invite the bowl to sound, I invite you to come into your body and notice your senses. Because often when we're hit with kind of tough topics like this, we have a tendency to go straight to our head and think and figure it out. But it's probably really helpful to pay attention to how we're feeling. So let's just take a minute as the bowl sounds to notice that we are breathing, and notice that we're in bodies, and that we're in a room. Just become present. We're going to stay with that same feeling as I light the chalice. Again, just notice your body, see the light, reflect on the visual aspects of it, and whatever associations come up for you when you see the chalice lit. Taking 3 deep breaths. Often when we think of slavery, I know that for me, this has been true. When I think of slavery, I think of 19th century, colonialism, ships with sails, carrying Africans from Africa to, various colonies, or maybe slave trader ships going up and down the coast of the United States. And after we talked last week, and I made that reference to, our freedom sitting on top of slavery and oppression, I thought, maybe I ought to look into that a little sooner rather than later, because I have this sense that, of course, slavery has a much longer history than that. So I started doing a little digging, and I found myself learning things that I was shocked to learn. So I started looking at the history of slavery, and I knew it was long, but I didn't really quite understand how much a part of human history it is. And then that soon led me up to the present day, and basically what I would consider an epidemic of slave labor in our world now and in our economy. That's the part that's really, really troubling. So we're going to start with a brief history. I'm going to call it brief because it's a summary, but it's actually an awful lot of data. It's a lot of data, right? The outline I'm going to be sharing comes from an organization called Free the Slaves, which works to provide education and information to the public and also to actually free enslaved people. So, a cursory history of slavery worldwide. Let's go back almost 7,000 years to Mesopotamia, which is what we think of as sort of one of the original, like, real country, state, city state kind of place, built on slavery. So that's about 6,800 before the Common Era. Fast forward from there to Egypt, 2575 BCE. Temple art records celebrations of capturing slaves in battle. And they would actually send expeditions up the Nile to capture slaves. Fast forward another 2,000 years, the city-state of Athens in 550 BCE uses as many as 30,000 slaves just in its silver mines. Think about Greek art and Greek like silver work that we see as like in museums. 30,000 slaves in the silver mines alone. Now move to the Roman Empire, and this is close to the end of the Roman Empire we're talking about. 100 in the Common Era. We're 120, right? So we're moving, kind of getting closer and closer. The Roman Empire is kind of peaking and getting ready to start its decline. Roman military campaigns capture slaves by the thousands. Some estimate that the population of Rome is more than half enslaved. The year 500, Anglo-Saxons, some of my ancestors, probably some of yours, Anglo-Saxons enslaved the native Britons when they invade England. 1380, in the aftermath of the Black Plague, Europe's slave trade booms. 1440, Portuguese traders bring the first large cargo of slaves from West Africa to Europe. So this is the beginning of what we often think of as the slave trade, okay? 1444, it's the Portuguese bringing slaves from West Africa to Europe. 1500s, 1526, Spanish explorers bring the first African slaves to the New World, the United States. Now, I know that I have often thought, well, slavery was a Southern thing. Not really. 1641, Massachusetts was the first British colony to legalize slavery. All right. Then there's this long era of abolition that gets started. It starts with the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph, and in Britain, the abolition of the slave trade happens. During the French Revolution, the National Assembly adopts a Declaration of the Rights of Man. There's a slave revolt in Haiti. And actually, what's interesting about that slave revolt in Haiti is that it's the only slave revolt that led to a free nation where slavery was banned, because when the slaves revolted in Haiti, Haiti then became independent from France, and the new country banned slavery. So what happens then in the early 1800s, the beginning of the 1800s, is that countries start banning the importation of slaves. Okay, they ban the international slave trade. So Britain, and in the United States, President Thomas Jefferson, who we know has a spotty history on this subject, they ban importing slaves from abroad. So in the US, it was 1807 when it became illegal to bring slaves from other places. Of course, by that point, we had so much slave labor in the US that we could just simply trade with the production of new slaves by birth here. Now, about this time in the early 1800s, people start thinking about other forms of slavery, like in 1833, the Factory Act in Britain banned the employment of children under the age of 9. And then it limited the workday of children. Pay attention to these numbers. It limited the workday of children between the ages of 13 and 18 to 12 hours. Crazy. Okay. So in the 1840s, France banned slavery entirely. Okay. Slightly before that, actually, the British banned slavery entirely. It was 1863 when Abraham Lincoln issued the first Emancipation Proclamation. There were two versions of that. The second one was more rigorous than the first. And it was 1865 when the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was adopted. Now, this is really interesting. Listen to the language of the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So catch that. Slavery is outlawed unless you've been convicted of a crime. So here's what happened after the Civil War. A system that was called peonage became the norm. The slaves that had been freed were systematically falsely arrested and convicted of crimes so that they could then be enslaved again. So they were falsely arrested and convicted of crimes, and then leased out to coal mines and iron mines and brick factories and plantations and the like, where they were forced to work again as slaves. Now, what's really interesting about this is that this is still true today. It is still true that anyone who's been convicted of a crime can be forced to do forced labor. So prison slave labor is a common thing. So I was recently educated by some of the young adults in my life that I need to check these data that some of our biggest new age, trendy, popular grocery stores buy from prison labor, buy food from prison labor. Didn't even know about that. I was shocked by that. So in the last 20 years, there has been an increase in education about global slave trade, global forced labor, global child labor. There have been international reports. The UN has done reports. Some private individuals and nonprofit organizations have done reports. There was a film that came out in 2001 that was called Slavery, a Global Investigation, which focused on the cocoa and chocolate industries and slave labor producing our chocolate. So in 2005, the UN International Labor Organization's first global report on forced labor put the number of slaves worldwide at 12.3 million. Now, within a few years, they updated that to about 21 million people, and we think it's actually higher than that. In 2014, the UN International Labor Organization estimated that profits generated from trafficking in human beings are as high as 150 billion a year. That's a lot of money. Okay. So let's pause for a second and just sit with how that feels. I was shocked. Slavery is very much a part of our global economy, and it's an increasingly global economy, which means that we are way more connected to slave-produced goods than we would like to admit. Now, the UN estimates that it's about 40 million people worldwide who are enslaved, producing things. And the US has laws in place that are supposed to prevent goods coming into the United States that have been produced by child or slave labor. But the problem is that that is enforced by the US Customs and Borders Protection Agency, and they don't have the staff to do the job adequately. So a recent Government Accountability Office report says that because of the lack of staff and resources in the Customs and Border Protection Agency to actually enforce those laws, they estimate that about $400 billion in goods made with slave labor enter the US every year. Okay, now we're going to set aside the issue of sex trafficking, which is its own whole industry and which is one of the major slave trades in the US. There's a huge sex trafficking industry in the US, mostly populated by teens. But that one's much harder to tackle. We're going to tackle the one that, or at least kind of try to touch on the one that we have a little bit of power over. Okay. So let's just talk about some of the products that we buy that probably have slave labor somewhere in the supply chain. Chocolate. Hershey's, Nestle, and Mars are all under intense scrutiny, even though they claim they're trying and they are getting better, but they are all still under a lot of scrutiny to prove that they are not using slave labor. So the deal is that cocoa is produced on farms in West Africa. Many of them use child labor to do that work. And what those companies often will say is that they can't guarantee, they can't know every single farm or how every single farm that they buy from is operating. So that's problematic. Batteries. So batteries require cobalt, which is mined in Central Africa, largely by children. Then that cobalt is sent to factories in China to be turned into batteries, and those factories in China are often, the work is often done by child or adult slave labor. And then those batteries get put into all sorts of things that we then buy, like machines and vehicles and flashlights and you name it, right? Okay, soap. Palm oil is harvested in Malaysia and Indonesia, largely by forced labor, significantly by forced labor. And then it's in our shampoo and our hand soap and all that kind of stuff. Other big offenders include coffee, cotton. Cotton is a big offender. Various clothing, sugar is a big offender. All these things. Things that, like, it's everything we use. Tons of stuff that we use. Technology, big issues with technology, because if you think about a computer and all the components that are in it, think about the supply chain. Not too long ago, Apple openly admitted that its iPhone X was produced by school children. And they've also been accused of the Apple Watches being made by school children in China under the guise of being company interns, calling them interns. Don't know if that's true. That's a charge that has been leveled against them. So the bottom line is this. We function in a global economy. Companies, they export their labor, right? They export the actual production to other countries. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is they buy components and parts from all over the world. So we were just talking after the last service about, say you've got your favorite little company that hand makes stuff. You know they're making it right here in the US, but they buy their cotton from somewhere. They buy their lace, they buy their elastic, they buy their whatever. So your shirt might have been made in the US, but you have no idea, even with that much detail, you have no idea how the components were made, which is horrifying. Right? This is horrifying. The supply chain is riddled with child labor and adult slave labor. Dozens and dozens of nations either outright allow it or just look the other way from routine forced labor in their companies, in their countries. A recent Department of Labor report indicated that 22 different countries, at least 22 different countries, use slave labor just to mine gold. So I read that and I thought, think about those Valentine's Day commercials. Think about those Mother's Day commercials or the Christmas commercials. Here's this lovely thing you can get to show love to your loved one. I mean, and I was imagining this picture of like And here's who produced this gold, like this child living this horrible, I mean, it's pretty horrible stuff, right? So, we live in a global economy. How many of us have clicked on Amazon? I was saying earlier that, recently I had to buy socks. Socks. Okay, so the first thing I did is I looked at the all natural, fair trade, the good socks, right? They were like $15 a pair. And I like need a lot of socks because I work on a farm. I couldn't afford, I probably could have if I'd been willing to give up some other stuff. But I bought the cheap socks. And they were probably cheap for a reason, right? Shoes, think about tennis shoes. All of those companies have at one time or another been found out for using slave labor by buying from suppliers that use slave labor. So, what do we do? What do we do? I know that for me, like part of me wants to just do that, right? I want to deny it. I want to pretend it. I want to minimize it. I want to avoid it. I want to ignore it. I jokingly said this morning, I want to eat potato chips because it's upsetting and it's depressing. Because I want to do the right thing. I mentioned Thomas Jefferson and when he abolished the importation of slaves, right? That act in 1807, mentioned that he's a troubling figure. And many of you have heard me talk about him before because he's one of my favorite figures in history. And I think the reason he's one of my favorite figures in history is because he's such a perfect example of the conundrum we all live in. He wanted to do the right thing. I mean, he wanted people to be free. He actually did. And he wanted slavery to end. But he also knew that the economy of the United States would collapse if they did it too fast. And he said that. He said, this is a bad thing. If we try to just outlaw slavery right now, the economy is going to collapse. And we're too young a nation to do that. He said it's going to cause civil war when we do it. And he was right. And so he found himself living a life where he did not live his values. He did not live his values. His economic reality was that he didn't live his values. And he's a great example for us too, because our economic reality is that we do not live our values. I was in a store yesterday and I saw this shirt and I was like, ooh, I want to, like, that shirt looks awesome. And I looked at it and I was like, oh, it's a good price. And then I thought, wait, it's a good price. Where was it made? It was made in China. So that's probably, I want people in China to have good jobs. I want that. But I'm not convinced about their track record on forced labor. How do I find out? How do I know? I don't know. This is a tricky and complicated situation. So it's interesting to think about what we can do and what we can't do, because we're not going to single-handedly fix the global economy. But I do feel like we have the opportunity and the ability to be more educated and more careful. It seems to me that when we think of social justice, we most often think of writing letters or marching or, voting. But the truth of the matter is, our social justice action, our primary social justice action from the first moment of our lives that we have money till the last day of our lives when we're spending money, is how we spend our money. That is our primary social justice behavior. We have to think about how we spend our dollars, because our dollars fuel the global economy. If you think about the wealth of the United States relative to the wealth of the nations that engage more heavily in forced labor, there's a pretty clear disparity, right? So those dollars that are fueling that economy that relies on slavery, it's a lot of it's our dollars. It's my convenience getting cheap socks, right? We were talking after the service this morning and someone was saying, I want to click on the Amazon button and I want the thing to show up tomorrow and I want it cheap. Our standard of living here is heavily dependent on a lower standard of living elsewhere. There's a Ursula K. Le Guin story, and I'm probably going to pronounce the title a little bit off, but I think it's called The Ones Who Walk from Omaha. And it's a story that's about a culture where everything's awesome. It's great. Everybody's happy. Everybody has all their needs met. But this culture, this everybody having everything they need is built on this child who lives in a basement, chained in a basement in terrible squalor and horrible conditions. And what happens in the story is that some people find out that this is what's happening and they walk away from their comfort. And I think Ursula K. Le Guin had a message there for us, right? How often are we so concerned about our own comfort that we kind of save our resources so that we can feel secure and safe, our definition of secure and safe and comfortable, not really thinking about like the $8 I saved on a pair of socks or whatever it was. Like how much could that have bought in the life of another human being? A lot. My $8, I could have given up my $8, right? I could have given up my $8, but I'm conditioned to think that I need to save. And I'm conditioned to a standard of living that is ridiculously high. Let's be honest. Our standard of living is pretty high that we think we need to be able to order it on Amazon and have it delivered to our door, and we're angry. And we're angry when our cell service is spotty. And people are living in horrible conditions without enough to eat. And so, I don't mean to be depressing. I don't mean to make us feel hopeless. I actually mean to make us feel empowered. I can look in my office and see wealth, incredible wealth. If we can reframe our own understanding of ourselves, if we can understand how much wealth we actually have, and we can just turn that dial down just a notch or two, we have the capacity to stop and think, I don't need 15 shirts. I don't need 15 shirts. I can't wear 15 shirts. Why would I need 15 shirts? Why would I need another shirt with a cool logo on it? Why would I need that? Right? What can I stop and think about instead? Like, maybe I want to think more wisely about where I put those dollars. So maybe I want to give a little money to free the slaves, or maybe I want to think about, some other organization that's doing something about that global economy issue. And so it's not something we can fix tomorrow. We are all caught in an economy that is global, where we can't know every single thing we buy. We can't know every single component that went into it. We can't. But we can start to think about it. And that's what I would encourage us to do, is just think about it. Just become present with it. Just become aware that slavery isn't done. Slavery is an economic tool that has been used since the beginning of human society. It is still an absolutely central part of our global economy. We are still absolutely benefiting from the economics of slavery. And we have some responsibility and opportunity to think about that and to think about how we interact with it. So let's try to do that. Think about it when you go to the store, go online next time. Just ask yourself, do I really need that? Do I want to take a minute to think about how it was made, where it was made? Do I want to maybe use my resources some other way? How can I live my values just a little more today? So take another deep breath. Notice your body. Notice the air around you and the sounds and the smells. And just take a minute to take that in, because that's a lot. This chalice light that we have, it represents a few things. One of the things it represents is our willingness and our determination to see things more clearly, to seek truth, to shine light into dark places. It represents courage and passion and commitment to actually do something once we see things. And it also represents community, the warmth, the fellowship, the support that we have as a community together to try and hold ourselves both in comfort and also accountability as we move together to make the world a better place. So I'm going to extinguish the chalice, but I hope that we can all carry that with us as we go into our week as consumers in a consumer culture, and just be a little bit more awake, a little bit more aware, a little bit more committed, and a little bit more brave about how we do things.